Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence,
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood,
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
and beyond. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Hi and welcome. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Today we'll be talking about diversity in gifted education and the struggle that minorities face to be recognized as gifted. Our guest today is Dr. Joy Lawson Davis, and she's the author of the book Bright, Talented, and Black, A Guide for Families of African American Gifted Learners. She's also co-author of the Equity-Based, Culturally Responsive Bill of Rights for Gifted Students of Color, and that can be found in NAGC's publication Gifted Child Today. We'll talk about biases against not only young Black students, but members of other minority communities as well. Our next episode will be the last one before our holiday break. We'll re-release some of our past episodes while we're off to help you catch up, and then on January 9th, we begin our second year of Mind Matters. We've got a great schedule of guests and topics that you said you wanted us to cover, and we're really looking forward to it. Before we go any further, I want to mention how much we appreciate listeners who've been so helpful in spreading the word about our podcast. Growth in our first 20 episodes has happened faster than we expected, with new listeners all over the globe subscribing every day. Remember to connect with us on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod and on Facebook and Instagram at Mind Matters Podcast. Also, please remember to let us know if there are guests or subjects that you really want us to talk about. You can email us at info@mindmatterspodcast.com. Speaking of our next episode, which will be the last one of 2018, the release date will actually be moved back a few days as we head to Minneapolis for the NAGC convention. We'll be talking to some speakers and attendees and giving you a peek at the latest developments in the world of educating, counseling, and parenting gifted people. Our episode will probably publish on or around Friday, November 16th. We'll update our social media feeds with info from the NAGC convention as well. Hang on for our conversation with Dr. Joy Lawson Davis next.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters,
This social relational bullying piece.
I mean, it's something as simple as being ignored and how damaging that is. Other groups of children gathering together and talking and laughing, and that gifted child is being left out. Sometimes the gifted child doesn't have a set of peers that they can be sitting with and feeling accepted. So there is a deep hunger. I mean, it's one of the basic human needs to belong, to be accepted, to be valued.
that's episode 3, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
If you want to have a real conversation about diversity in the gifted community, the first person you'd invite also happens to be today's guest.
Hi, I'm Joy Lawson Davis, the author of Bright, Talented, and Black, A Guide for Families of African American Gifted Learners.
So Joy, thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. You know, if you could take a minute and share with us some of the experience that have brought you to the mission of advocating for equitable gifted education.
There have been many life experiences that have led me to this cause. But you know, even as far back as a little girl in elementary school, I recall having been what we call content accelerated. I went from second grade to third grade for math in the afternoons. It wasn't the best experience because I believe the third grade teacher seemed to have some resistance to actually having me in her classroom in the afternoons. But later that year, my mom and my second grade teacher had a conversation about grade acceleration, you know, whole grade skipping. They called it skipping back then. And I think my mom decided against it because of my size. I was a petite kid, and probably because she didn't feel like she wasn't sure about what that all meant. But throughout school, I was able to take advantage of other opportunities for acceleration, enrichment. And then later, as a first-generation college student, I attended a predominantly white school, and I was only one of 2 Black females in our program, in my undergrad program. In that situation, I often thought, why weren't there more students like me here? Mm-hmm. And so that started my thinking and my concern about that issue. And later, then being a mom of 3 very gifted students, I really had to fight hard in the school district and fight hard to get resources to get my students, my children, where they needed to be to help develop their gifts. And when I was a teacher, an elementary art teacher, my principal came to me one day and said, hey, look, we need someone who would go to a conference on gifted education. I didn't have any idea what he was talking about at that time, but I was gung-ho and very excited to do new things. I was a risk taker. I didn't mind driving, traveling. I didn't mind that at all. And that was 1985.
Wow.
Eventually, I was able to go to grad school. I met Joyce Fantasso-Basca. She was my entry into the field. Joyce kind of nudged me and said, you should do this. This will be good for you. And we think that you would have a lot to offer the field. And it started there. But I consistently saw the inequities, the underrepresentation of Black students, of Black adults, of other ethnic group backgrounds that always concerned me. And so once I arrived into the field, that was the biggest issue that stayed heavy on my mind, was that we were simply not doing as good a job as we could. Sometimes I believe that people just didn't think of children of color or culturally diverse students in that way. And so that's where it began.
It is interesting how sometimes that pathway isn't always what you expect it to be. And then you end up and you realize it's where you were supposed to be, I think, that whole time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about gifted learners from culturally diverse backgrounds, what do you see as some of the major barriers that these learners face related to accessing services?
Across the country, Emily, school districts rely heavily on classroom teachers to refer students for programming, to look at students and say, I think this child has a special gift or some special talents, or this child has an unusually high level of understanding of content. This child is different from their peers in that way. And unfortunately, because of that reliance on teacher referral, many students of color, culturally diverse students, and I'm referring here to African American, Hispanic students, and even low-income students, will not be referred for gifted services. And so that's the first major barrier, and that is a systemic barrier because it exists within the school and it exists over time, from generation to generation. We have a set of classroom teachers who don't see Black students, brown students, low-income students when they think about giftedness. They don't see them in that way. As a matter of fact, a recent study indicated that Black students and brown students could have the same level of achievement scores, but were 6 times as likely not to be referred for gifted services by classroom teachers. And the majority of our classroom teachers right now are middle-class white females. And so that presents a cultural mismatch, so to speak, that disallows these students to even be considered. That's a major, major barrier.
There are other barriers as well. For example, the perception among policymakers that gifted students don't need special services the way other kids with challenges do.
Gifted ed is unlike special education in that we don't have any federal laws that mandate specific services. What we have to rely on are state mandates which sometimes are unfunded, and localities that are very interested in this because perhaps their group, their community presses this issue. We have to rely on that sense of commitment to gifted students rather than relying on an overarching law. And so the lack of laws and the systemic teacher and school barriers around perception of giftedness, I think, are the 2 greatest barriers that we have.
And while those issues exist, schools are becoming more and more aware of it every day. Progress is happening, slowly.
Emily, in my work providing professional learning opportunities and consulting with school districts across the country, I'm seeing an increased use of the universal screening process. And what universal screening does, it casts a wide net by assessing students all of one particular grade level. And some districts actually have enough funding that they use universal screening for multiple levels at the elementary school. Some will do it at the second, third, and fourth, and some will do it at the third grade only or the second grade only. What this universal screener does is to administer a nationally normed ability test to all students in a particular grade level. And by doing that, then they will see from that group of students, many students who perhaps would not be referred for services at all, who pop up, on the universal screener as having high scores, 85th percentile, 90th percentile, 95th percentile, students who would normally, again, not be recognized by classroom teachers because the tests assess for certain kinds of responses. Another is school districts that are now beginning to target Title I schools for talent development programs. And they're doing that now because of the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA Act, because ESSA is requiring schools to actually document how they're providing services for students in those particular schools. Title I schools are those schools that serve students who are low income, and also requiring the school districts to document professional development for teachers in those schools. So the ESSA funding is pushing schools in that way. And I want to, kind of go back to those two procedures that I used in a school district several years ago when I worked as a local district coordinator. And I was so surprised in the district that we actually had been doing universal screening, and the individuals who were in the research and evaluation department had access to all those scores, but the scores weren't being used. And then just happened upon it when I spoke with my assistant superintendent. And I said, wow, so you mean we already have some test scores that the gifted department, which we didn't have as much money, we don't have to pay for? She said, yes, we've had these. And so I went to see the director in that department, and she provided access to hard copies. What I did with those scores was I disaggregated the scores by school. So I found all the Title I schools just because I was really looking to increase the number of gifted students identified in Title I schools. And I'm new in this district, and I really want to get a sense of what's really going on here, because there were none. There were no students from Title I schools identified as gifted in the district when I arrived. And what I found were student scores in those top ranges that, so I found numbers. And I took those numbers to the schools, to their principals, and said, do you realize that you've got these kids in your school who would on any given day be identified as gifted, or at least referred for the gifted program, but nobody's doing anything with this, And they were a little surprised because, principals get busy, and the assessment process was not their job at the time. That was the research and evaluation team's job, how we work in silos. And it led to my being able to get into the Title I schools, actually begin having conversations and conducting gifted education, professional development, we called it back then, in Title I schools. And that had never happened before. Because, Title I schools, low-income kids, we're using a deficit approach. We're looking to get them at least to pass the state assessments and to go from grade to grade. We're not looking at the high ability. We're not looking for sparks of intelligence. We're not looking for that. So it was a very profitable experience for me and for the district during that time. And so when the studies came out about universal screening, I thought, my district was one of those that had been using those, had those scores, but not been using them to look for giftedness in their populations. Another trend is that some districts are allowing for the selection of students who might be in the top 10% of their particular group. In this particular district, I won't name it, but I can share what they did. The gifted ed specialist was given the opportunity to target a group, and she decided that she would choose a group of Black females. And so she looked at the top 10% of that group of students and formed a cluster group of those students to work with on a regular basis. She gave it a name. I won't name it yet because she's getting ready. She's writing about it, and I'm trying to get her to publish something about this really unique program. And what she found was that once those girls were targeted and they had the opportunity to sit around and have conversations about being smart and being Black and being female, that their sense of self-esteem, she thought, was raised just by getting together, and she's doing some great things with them. So that targeting of students at a particular grade level or a particular group, to help. But these program changes, even though they're great trends and we've seen some success, they have to be aligned with appropriate training for teachers and counselors and administrators who are all involved in this, so they can understand who these kids are and what kinds of challenges they'll face once they're into these services, once they've been identified, once they've been pointed out or pulled out. There are some huge barriers that exist for these students as well that go beyond ability grouping, go beyond intelligence. It has a lot to do with their psychosocial needs and how they're viewed by the group itself, the gifted group itself, as well as by society in general.
So, in recognizing there is implicit bias involved along the way, what kind of professional development do you recommend schools provide for their teachers and staff?
I think it's also important for all teachers in all schools today to go through culturally responsive pedagogical training. They need to go through this training. Now, training can be held by introducing teachers into a course or by doing a series of workshops, but the workshops have to also help teachers, as you said, recognize the implicit biases that exist, within our groups. Within our cultures, from teacher to student, from teachers to community, but also the kinds of things like microaggressions that occur that teachers are not always so aware of, but that happen all the time. Things that teachers might say or might believe, and then that belief manifests itself in something that's said. Gifted education is a social justice issue. It is an issue of equity, and equity is always, I think, a social justice issue. But then once teachers have, become more aware, and they're engaging in conversations during these sessions or courses, the next thing for them to be more aware of is, what does it feel like to be a student, particularly a new student in a gifted program where you may be only one or two of those students of that particular group, how isolated, is already isolated to be gifted in a larger group. But then you take me, I'm a Black male, and you pop me into a program and everybody around me, still they don't look like me by race. And how complicated is that? What's coming with me? My sense of self, what we call in social science the blessings and the burdens of race. Even that kid who may be identified in the classroom, who whenever Black History Month comes along or Black History issues come up, everybody looks at that one kid because he or she may happen to be Black, or the same with Hispanic learners, So being isolated, what does it mean to be isolated? How does that feel? Even bullied, pointedly being bullied, an African American or Hispanic student, and then spending time with a majority group of white students, and then going back to their group, and the group is saying, you're acting like you're white. All of those kinds of issues have to be wrapped into this professional development. And some of the best resources for understanding that is the families and communities of these students. In my research, even after I published Bright, Talented, and Black, I spoke with a lot of parents, Emily. At first I solicited stories from families online, through a survey approach. They were anxious to tell their story of their gifted child who had been, who was very different from the time they were born, who required less sleep, who, just loved using words and learned how to read early. All the traits of giftedness were there, but then the cultural issues came about as they would try to seek out services for this particular kid, who was just as gifted as any other, but because he or she was of a cultural minority group, would not get the same response, So these parents were anxious to tell their stories. And in hearing the stories, then that's when you really begin to hear what these kids go through. Mm-hmm. One I'll kind of tell about, and I wrote some of these stories into a chapter in my second book, Gifted Children of Color Around the World. There's a piece in there about families. And one parent who actually said that she had a little girl, and this mom was a physician, and she was a first generation in the United States. She was Nigerian, and she's a physician, so she has two little girls, and they love science, just like their mom. So one girl actually was able to qualify for the Duke Talent Search Program as I believe she was a middle school, or maybe 5th or 6th grade. In this summer, the mom sends this little girl off to a summer program at a university in Texas. They were in Louisiana. They sent her to Texas with the high hopes of her having a great experience because she's a talent search kid. She's very bright. But she gets into class, and all the other students in this particular science class were white males. So here's this little girl, dark skin, going to this classroom, and she looks around. She doesn't see anybody there like herself. And to make that even worse, some of the boys started kind of taunting her. And then finally somebody says, "Are you sure you belong here?" Mm. And that struck a chord with me. And I thought, wow, are you sure you belong here? So just imagine that this happened many times over to these children when they get into a gifted program. So how do they handle that? How does the family teach them how to self-advocate? How to teach them how to, be resilient? How does the family help them? Hopeful that the program services will be what that child needs, but also recognizing that sometimes they'll be up against a wall. And some parents are not willing to put their children through that. So there's a stigma even. I heard that word used again. I hadn't heard it used with gifted programs for a long time. And just a few weeks ago, I heard that word used again about being in a gifted program, the stigma attached to being in a gifted program. Wow, I thought there's a lot that needs to happen. Yeah.
I know a lot of schools are starting to use local norms in order to identify underrepresented populations. Can you talk a little bit about what that process looks like?
Local norms actually has been used for a long time, and we just haven't used it as much or haven't spoken about using it as much in gifted ed. But local norms is a way to develop a comparative set of scores within a district by a particular subgroup. So if you want to look for students in one particular race or another, then you would disaggregate just those scores so that you would have a clear picture of how the students within that particular group in that school district scored. In some districts will actually have their own people to develop the local norms, and some actually can send them off to the company that actually produced the test and ask the company based on the demographics to produce those norms for them. Local norms do to some level mediate the degree of bias in nationally standardized test norming process, but it also doesn't fix the problem either of receiving, of getting more students identified. So there are lots of people who kind of caution against the use of them or not looking for them to be the perfect answer. But if we have not, first of all, once again, if we haven't raised teacher awareness, we haven't trained teachers, then these students who may be selected to go into these services based on local norms, even if it's only a few more than you had before, they're going to be up against educators who don't believe in them anyway. So we have to be very, very careful in the use of norms as the only answer. The use of what we call multiple criteria for an identification protocol is best practice. And so that one test is not, or nor should it ever be, the only way that the child receives services or gets into a gifted program.
So taking all of this information and thinking about these groups, what are some things that teachers can really do once kids are admitted into the gifted programs to be very culturally responsive to those populations?
So I mentioned earlier that culturally responsive approaches or pedagogy, it's a whole body of knowledge. And those individuals who have created this whole model, Dr. Geneva Gay, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who just recently retired, are individuals that are well known for the introduction of culturally relevant teaching into the classroom. Their view is that, of course, all cultures have norms, traditions, beliefs, and all cultures have particular ways that they do things. And so in order for us to have a more culturally responsive classroom, in the gifted classroom, we need to make sure that we introduce those kinds of norms, beliefs, and traditions, and the ways that individuals do things into the classroom. We know more now about traits of a culture. We have lots of information that gives us traits of particular cultures, which cultures are more communal or familial, meaning that, the students enjoy and flourish in environments where they have opportunities to work together as groups. The fact that these students may be in environments where there's going to be a little more noise than you would have, in some typical classroom settings, and they can function in that setting. There's more engagement, there's more conversation, there's more across the classroom discussion, and yet these students are doing okay. They'll do well in those settings, as well as having access to the higher levels of understandings, that come by way of being in the gifted program. So to pair the culturally responsive pedagogies with the gifted education pedagogies is probably the more ideal setting for these kids. As a matter of fact, we're hearing now more that all students do well in a more culturally responsive classroom. It teaches us to teach our students what the real world is going to be like. First of all, Emily, when you get out into the world and they go out to work for companies or in any kind of an institution, they're going to come across people from different cultural backgrounds. And so unless teachers have a better understanding of how all these other cultures function, then they're not going to be able to teach their students that way, and therefore they're not going to prepare their students for real world experiences.
Within the culturally responsive pedagogy, teachers are recommended to have what is called cross-cultural experiences. What kind of experiences do you recommend?
I recommend teachers have a cross-cultural experience in the space of another group. So where do they find those spaces where they exist? One of the spaces that I recommended when I was teaching a culturally responsive course for undergrad education teachers a few years back at the University of Louisiana. I had a course that I had to teach called Teaching in a Diverse Society. And so one of the recommendations was that my students, who at the time were predominantly white, Cajun students, would go into another community's festival. There's a lot of festivals going on down in Louisiana, but also to even go into a religious experience, go into a church experience and see how different that was from being a Catholic. And so the culturally responsive pedagogy gives us opportunities for teachers to see and know other cultures better.
Yeah.
That's when we begin to see some change, when you really have an opportunity to get to know and respect and value the use of representational and authentic history, representational literature is absolutely critical.
Yes.
Children need to see themselves in the material that's being taught to them. That's critical. We absolutely have to do that. So that's how and why culturally responsive pedagogy has to be integrated and merged with gifted pedagogy to teach these kids.
And so what about families? How can families and parents make sure that their kids are, provided the services? How can they advocate for their children?
The quick and skinny is that families need to know how to advocate using gifted education lingo or language. They need to know the language of gifted ed. They need to understand the benefits of gifted services. And again, that comes with training for families. It comes with workshops. It comes with material being made available to parents. In my book, I produced, and probably one of the first and maybe the only even now, a glossary of terms for gifted ed for families. And so in this glossary, it teaches families what is cluster grouping. That's one of the grouping strategies. It teaches them the difference between an ability test and an achievement test. They need to know the language so that they can stand toe-to-toe with the educators, be able to talk it and walk it. You know, we say talk the talk, walk the talk. They need to be able to do both, but they can't unless they can meet the teachers where they are. And then the teachers have to meet families where they are and respect and value them as being the cultural agent. The families know the community. They know their children best. And because they may happen to come from a different cultural group doesn't mean that we will look upon them any differently, any less. Their kids are gifted too. And so we have to bring them to the table. So advocating, teaching parents how to advocate through use of the language of the field and bringing parents to the table so we can form what we believe to be the best partnerships for culturally diverse students is for these parents and these teachers to sit at the table at the same time.
So, who do you think generates the momentum to get this ball rolling?
Teachers embracing all students, all communities that's having potential for giftedness. I think that's critical. And the responsibility then is on the educational system to making sure that their teachers have that kind of knowledge by training, by bringing these conversations to the fore, having people sit down together. There's some tough conversations to have, or courageous conversations. That's been overused, of course, but they have to, be had. We have to sit down with families and with communities and embrace their children and truly believe that giftedness does exist in every community. I think that's the onus of the districts, the school districts. They have that responsibility. Communities need to also step up and say, we believe our children have potential for giftedness and we want in on this. We are not going to shy away or back down from it, but we want to know what we can do to get access for our students to these programs as well. So there's a responsibility on the part of the school district, but there's also a responsibility on the part of the communities. And when that happens, it's like magic, Emily. It's just really like magic when those two groups can come together. And I've seen it happen in a district or two, and I've seen some things really begin to change. Teachers who have a better understanding, more respect and value for giftedness, no matter what is packaged in, and communities that feel empowered enough to sit down at the table and say, we want our students to have access, and we'll do what we need to do as well.
Dr. Joy Lawson Davis, author of Bright, Talented, and Black, a guide for families of African American gifted learners, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
More coming up.
To reach the Mind Matters podcast, go to our website, mindmatterspodcast.com, and click on Contact. Follow us on Twitter @MindMattersPod, on Facebook @Mind Matters Podcast, or you can reach our YouTube channel through our website. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Sometimes it feels like an uphill battle to get schools to provide any gifted education services. Between budget cuts and states reducing requirements to identify and provide services to gifted learners, our community frequently feels forgotten. When you look closely at the statistics of classically underrepresented populations in our community, minority students, English language learners, students from poverty, you realize that if we don't actively seek to identify and support them, we are missing an opportunity to tap into the great potential of many students. We've learned that we must take active steps to find these students who may not fit the mold of the majority of students who've historically been identified for gifted and talented programs. That won't happen without educators and parents advocating for changed policies and protocols to the status quo. The work of Dr. Joy Lawson Davis and others have established a path and model we can use to work toward the ideal of ensuring all gifted and talented students are provided with the services they need and deserve. Marginalized groups of students, like students of color, students who have English as a second language, and students growing up in poverty, may not have voices strong enough to be heard on their own. But when we all speak together as a community, our voices will be heard. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Thanks for listening.
We're gonna be stronger. This is our fight. We're gonna be stronger.
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast with Emily Kircher Morris. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. If you'd like to show your support for Mind Matters, find us in Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe and leave us a positive review. Start a discussion and follow us on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod or on Facebook at Mind Matters Podcast. Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.